Hello and welcome to this video on how to make your own fruit press for cider, perry and wine among many others. The size we're making is relatively small, but you can scale it to suit your purposes as needed. For example, much larger if you intend to make a wine press, or much smaller if you intend to use it for something like cheese. Making a fruit press may seem unnecessary and extravagant, but for those who want to produce authentic or traditional cider, wine, perry and so on, or who want to eschew the trappings of modern society, it can be a rather enjoyable and interesting project. That is, if you want to go beyond an electric juicer, benchtop blender, or bucket with a macerator. For this, we'll make some things closer to a traditional wooden press than a modern plastic, steel, and sometimes wood press. It can be used for fruit, grapes, and more. You could even use it for cheese and other similar products needing pressing, but this is ill-advised as it can lead to contamination with the cheese culture. It is much better to have a dedicated press for things like cheese, where you have bacteria involved, and something for those that involve yeast, like fruit pressing. The basic idea for this is a cylinder with perforations, a large flat plate to press down on the fruit itself, a frame to hold the cylinder and plate in place and act as a means of supporting the press plate, and finally a tray to collect all the juices, otherwise this entire exercise becomes rather pointless. This could be built into a stand trolley or freestanding, so long as you're willing to use it somewhere and anywhere. Otherwise, having it as a more portable unit is somewhat more convenient for being in the kitchen or something like that. First we have the hopper or cylinder with perforations. This can be made in the more common style of a barrel with a steel band or hoop that holds it in place. Instead we're going to go with something a little bit different. We'll use close to a standard almost a barrel-like stave format, but we'll position these so that the narrow side faces into the press and the wide side faces outward from the press. This will be held in place by a wooden hoop. The reason we're using the narrow side facing inside of it is so that the plate can run along the narrow recesses like a guide or a channel. You could just use square sections of wood and a circular plate instead. The choice is yours, but we like this option simply to ensure that everything continues to move down in a straight line and we don't get anything caught unexpectedly. This should end up vaguely resembling a bucket once it's completed. This is where you will be pressing your fruit and where the juice will leak out from as well. Next is the actual press plate itself. This can be made using a steel section of threaded rod or a wooden rod that has been given a thread by passing it through an appropriately sized nut or similar. Something that has the inverse of the thread you want to cut. At the bottom of the threaded rod, you will need a wider section. This can be made from a second piece of wood glued and screwed to it. This will be sitting on the press plate itself. Now, what's important here is that it won't be attached to the press plate. That needs to be able to float freely while being held in place, and we'll get to explaining what we mean by that in a moment. Just as long as you understand that this sits on the press plate but isn't connected to it directly. Around this, you're going to need a matching frame, effectively something just circular enough to sit around the threaded rod and the base plate for it. This will prevent the base plate from shifting sideways and falling off. On top of this, you'll now need another plate. This will effectively close over and cover over most of that wide section on the threaded rod, ensuring that the threaded rod can pull the plate that presses the fruit freely without getting stuck. If you did it other ways, you wouldn't be able to have the press plate run within the channels on the side, and you would have to use a perfectly circular or whichever shape you preferred press plate, as it would also rotate the entire time it moved up and down, which can lead to it getting stuck in places, especially if the rod you're using is not straight. The other important thing here is that, well, you want to avoid it getting stuck in place, or stuck only going one way, which would be far worse. The top of this rod will be pushed through the top of the frame, but in order to get this right first, you need the measurements from the rod length itself, and these may vary from what you planned. The rod needs to be long enough to reach the bottom of the container that you're going to be using as your press container, the hopper, if not the very bottom of the hopper. Ideally, you want to have a little bit of free room at the bottom, as not all of the fruit content will be squished entirely. One of the things that will affect this more than the others is where you place the hole for the handle that you'll be using to be able to turn this threaded rod up and down. This is literally a hole drilled through the top of the screw that you place a chamfer on. You then slide a rod through this, and you place small holes on each side of this that you can add something like a screw to. We're using pins, but the results are the same. The reason you use these are that by having a piece of pin stock, a screw, or a nail in here, the handle cannot shift left or right, and as a result, you're always able to ensure you get proper grip and you can properly squish the contents within your press. Now, if you're using something like threaded steel rod, you're likely to be able to find it easier to use some nuts and attach these to the top and bottom of a handle that's been shaped accordingly. And now for the frame itself. The frame will need to be made with everything we have described so far in mind. At its most basic, the idea is just to make a rectangle. It is a little bit wider than the hopper itself. You want to use a tray, or it is the outer diameter of the hopper if you're not going to use a tray. This is so that if you want to use the tray, you can fit it in there, and if you're not using it, and you can fit just the hopper into the position. Otherwise, things would just drop straight out and you'd have a great deal more difficulty trying to press your fruit. We're making this at a ratio of 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 2. The exact numbers aren't going to be so important as long as you understand it needs to be much taller than it is wider. In this instance, the hopper is both 30 centimeters across and 30 centimeters high. That's 12 freedom units. This means the base of the frame will be roughly the same width internally at 30 centimeters, and it will be roughly 60 centimeters high. Each side at the bottom will be made with 2 legs pointing out at 90 degrees. Across the top will be 3 pieces of wood. 1 internal piece and 2 on the outside. The middle piece is mostly the important one here, as it will be where you drill to create a threaded section. This is what the rod that you use to press down on your fruit will be going through. This can be replaced with drilling a suitably sized hole, and then putting a nut and gluing it in there. The nut needs to be glued on the top side, but recessed into the wood. This will allow something like a steel rod to pass freely through without getting in the way. Once you've put this together, as you can see here, and all the parts are glued and screwed, it should roughly function as it is. Now, to be clear about it, assembly is the next important step, and it's kind of important. If you don't have it assembled correctly as you see now, the next steps won't work. To assemble your press, you place the frame on a solid surface. Then you take the threaded rod and you turn it through the hole in the top of the frame until it is worked all the way to the top. Now you place the hopper in the frame. It can be glued and screwed in place if you wish, or you might prefer to rely on a friction fit if not using a wooden tray. In terms of the threaded rod, if you wish, you can make the frame first, and you should be confident that you're going to get it right, then put the handle on the rod and pass it from the top down to the bottom, then attach the various parts of the press plate that you need. This is slightly easier to assemble, but it also means you need to get your numbers exactly right, and well, as much as measure twice cut once sounds good, it doesn't always work out. Now it should function, or at least function reasonably well, but this assumes you're not going to use a standalone separate tray. If that is the case and you aren't going to use one, you can instead make one yourself, and this can be done by simply using butt joints to form a frame around a flat rectangular piece of wood. Do make sure to add a hole to the bottom of the tray with a slope or chamfer to ensure the fruit juice can be collected. It is better to use something like a steel kitchen tub, as it can be easily cleaned and there's less chance of contamination, and it's one reason why we suggest not using a wooden tub, but instead going with the modern trappings of a metal tub. With everything in place, you can press your own fruit juice for very little cost and likely far less than a commercially made press. As unfortunate as it is, the commercial made units cost more, but they cost more largely owing to the shipping. The actual production itself isn't the majority of the cost that you're going to be paying out of pocket. Of course, if you wish to make your own, you could change the wood to your choice of wood if so desired. We used a combination of pine and oak. A pine for the frame that would have no contact whatsoever with the fruit, and oak for the parts that would. But you may wish to use a timber local to you, such as maple, birch, and Baltic pine. This will be entirely down to your personal preference as far as appearance, aesthetics, availability materials, cost, and possibly an effect it would have on the fruit if pressed. For example, pine is generally a bad idea unless you can seal it thoroughly. That's because some of the pine resin may find its way into what you're pressing, and it doesn't take much to ruin the fruit juice. Of course, much of the same thing applies to the choice of using a threaded steel rod or wooden rod with thread. You can choose to use either based on the availability of materials, what you can do at home or in a workshop yourself, and the price of doing this. And finally, of course, the fact that you may or may not wish to use steel or other metals within your press. And no matter what you choose, the end result is going to be much the same. It will be a freshly pressed juice you can then turn into things like cider, perry, and wine. Of course, what you choose to make, if it's not going to be consumed immediately as fresh juice, is up to you. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.